Welcome back, everyone, to Textual Criticism of the Old and New Testaments. Today we're going to be venturing into the intentional changes that were made by the scribe. We're going to do this in two parts. Again, we're utilizing the information that's in Paul Wagner's A Student's Guide to Textual Criticism of the Bible, and it's a great book. I suggest that you get it if you're interested in the topic. So let's jump into it. We're going to look at changes to spelling and grammar, resolving difficulties in the text, and finally harmonizing between different passages. So keep this in mind. These we think are intentional changes that they've made to the texts. In other words, they thought to themselves, I'm going to change X to Y. Sometimes they were right in the change, sometimes they weren't. So just because it's an intentional change doesn't mean that it's not an error. So just keep that in mind as we go through it. So, one of the things that was done was that scribes would attempt at times to replace archaic or older archaic forms with forms that would be understood better by the reader. So, in Psalm 11:1, k, the kaf here, this means like or as. This is the normal way of writing it, or the more common way. But there's a more poetic form, kmo, which is a longer form. It's perhaps older, archaic. And this form, either the scribe didn't realize what it was or was unfamiliar with it in some way to the point that he thought that the kaf and mem here represented your. This is a suffix. At any rate, what happened is he thought that this was in error, and so he changed the sentence. He changed the original reading, which was, flee to the mountain like a bird, to flee to your mountain, a bird. There are difficulties that the scribes would attempt to resolve by modifying the text to make something clearer. So in Isaiah 39:1, we have the word chazak. And chazak usually means to be strong or to become strong. But in an extended sense, it can mean to get well or to recover, which makes sense, but it just doesn't happen all that often. So in the passage, instead of saying chazak, to get well, the scribe replaced that with a more common word, chaya, which means to get well. So that was an intentional change to resolve a difficulty in the passage that didn't seem to make sense with the word chazak. In the New Testament, in Mark 1:2-3, these are two verses that utilize quotes, as the New Testament does at times, from two different passages in the Old Testament. So here, these two verses are a composite of Isaiah 40, verse 3, and Malachi 3, verse 1. But the earlier manuscripts attribute it simply to Isaiah. So it says, as the prophet Isaiah said, and then it quotes from both places. Well, of course, this presented the difficulty to the scribe, who realized that only one of those quotes came from Isaiah. So then that was amended. Here, this Greek is the older Greek, or the Greek of the older manuscripts, by Isaiah the prophet. It was amended to read by the prophets in general, as opposed to Isaiah, so that it would actually make sense in the context. So resolving a difficulty, changing the text. Harmonization, modifying a passage to make it agree with another passage. So, in John 19, verses 19 and 20, we read, and Pilate wrote an inscription also, and put it on the cross, as it is written, quote, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. And at the end of verse 20, it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Well, in Luke 23, some manuscripts following the sentence, now there was also an inscription above him, this is the King of the Jews, insert this underlined phrase. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. This is taking two passages that are accounts of the same incident and trying to harmonize them. This sort of thing happens when the scribe perhaps knows of another text that reads a similar way and tries to bring that information in to make the texts stand in harmony with one another. So these are intentional changes. So that's part 1. Tune in tomorrow for intentional changes part 2 as we see the other intentional changes that the scribes tended to make.